I understand the hesitation for writers to hand their stuff out, and I understand the fear of an idea being stolen, perhaps, and I mean that's what you're talking about, just this overriding idea that somebody's going to steal your great idea, and I suppose that's possible, but you're right. You do need to get your writing out, being read by as many people as you can. you know, I happened to get lucky and it fell into Mel Gibson's hands. But had it not, other people would have read the script and I would have gotten notes back. I mean,
Welcome to Third and Fairfax, the official podcast of the Writers Guild of America West. I'm your host, Brian Gary. In our latest episode, Monique Sorgen talks with screenwriter, creator, and showrunner Jason Keller about crafting his Apple TV Plus comedy series, Stick, segueing from film to television, finding the funny, and a whole lot more. Listen and subscribe to Third and Fairfax on Spotify, Apple, or Libsyn, and watch us on the Writers Guild of America West's YouTube channel. And now, here's Monique in conversation with Jason.
Welcome back to Third and Fairfax. I am Monique Sorgen, and I am here today with Jason Keller, who is the showrunner and creator of the new Apple Plus show called Stick about golfing. How are you, Jason?
I'm good. I'm good, Monique. Nice to be here.
Nice to meet you.
Yeah.
Um, I always like to know how people got into this business. Like, where did you come from, and what made you one day go like, oh, I'm gonna do screenwriting and TV writing?
I mean, you've done enough of these interviews to know that that is a long answer. There, always a strange route to this business, I think. I grew up in Indiana, and I was always really interested in the entertainment business. I had a mother who sometimes did on camera, was an on camera spokesperson, as a young kid. So I would see that, which was interesting to me. But I really was interested in movies. I loved movies and grew up with movies. I had a grandfather that just absolutely was a cinemaphile and would take me to everything that was playing in Indianapolis, starting when I was 9 years old. Probably I saw a lot of inappropriate movies with him, a lot of R-rated
Yeah.
movies. But
I think
so,
that's generational. I saw Hair when I was 5.
oh yeah, I
Yeah,
remember.
and that's like naked and people die and
Yeah, it's heavy, right? I mean, it
yeah.
leaves an impression, I guess. Yeah, I saw Monty Python. I think it was The Meaning of Life, when I was just a young kid, which is a crazy movie to watch, if you're a young person. Um,
Mhm.
I was always drawn to the entertainment business, and I went to school at Ball State University and had an opportunity to go to London for a year and study my sophomore year at Ball State. And I took a film class. I took a film appreciation class in London, and I was sort of hooked after that class. I just, I was for the first time sort of introduced to some of the classics. I had a great English professor that just sort of opened my mind to cinema and westerns. Like for the first time, I was really introduced to westerns and found just a deep appreciation for a beautiful western from a storytelling standpoint. So it sort of started, it was a lot of different things, and I eventually was a junior in college and thought I want to go to Los Angeles and figure out some sort of future in the entertainment business. And so, as a young man, 19, 20 years old, I came out here and just started working wherever I could.
Yeah, just around Los Angeles, but like did you then like write spec scripts or and try and sell them, or did you do another career first?
I I I worked in any job I could find connected to the film business. I mean, I worked as a PA on, hundreds of commercials and films and anything that I could, you know, anything anybody would say yes to me. Sure, you can come, work for free for, a couple months on our, low budget movie. And I did those things. And, I took any job I was given. I worked in the wardrobe department, the makeup department, the, production office. I mean, I did everything. I was a writer's assistant for years. And all the while, I think I was just looking at how this business worked holistically. And writing was a thing that looking back, writing was the thing that I sort of consistently was interested in. I would get my hands on scripts, which were not easy to get a hold of back in the day. This is pre-internet, so you would get your hands on a screenplay and it was just like gold, and so I was really drawn to the writing aspect of the film business, and it, I started to educate myself about how to write screenplays, and just would I'm completely self-taught. I didn't go to film school, and would write at night and work on productions during the day, and I did that for 10 or 15 years.
Wow. What was your big break? And how did it happen?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there were a couple things that were important for me as a writer, as a young writer. I was invited to a writing fellowship called the New Harmony Writing Fellowship, which was a month-long project in the Midwest, and they workshopped your screenplay. There were playwrights there. There were people who had written musicals and musical theater there, and there were about 9 of us, I think. And for a month, we workshopped I had a screenplay that was accepted, and that was the real moment for me. I was there with Robert Schenken, who is a absolutely glorious playwright. A guy by the name of Jim Leonard, who is a TV writer and playwright. So I was with these, I'm forgetting his name now, but I was with these writers that were established and had really accomplished things in the business. And so for a month, I was able to watch them work and see how they wrestled with a scene and pull a script together or pull a play together and build it, or rebuild it from the ground up. And it sort of demystified the process for me at many levels. And so personally, for me as a writer, that was a big break for me. I was able to look behind the curtain a bit and see how really good writers would grind through a draft, and it was very enlightening for me.
When you say grind through, you mean just like get a first draft out as fast as possible, or do you mean the way they address the notes?
Well, both. I for me, and I think maybe for a lot of younger writers, at that time, you don't realize that, or at least I find it this way, and I found it very, very, eye-opening that, you have to just work a scene or work a screenplay, and find the problems and address the problems. And sometimes that doesn't work, and you got to go back to it, and you've got to go back to it, and you could call it rewrites, but I was watching these guys wrestle with a part of their work that wasn't snapping together. I watched them trying to figure out why a second act wasn't sort of progressing in the way that they wanted it to progress, but not having the answers, right? And I think that was a very interesting understanding for me, that these men and women who are professional writers that are doing these great things, that are writing amazing movies, they sit in a room and they struggle through a draft sometimes, and they come to a point in their work that they are, you know, they're sort of at wit's end about how to continue. And that was really amazing, to watch Robert Schenken, uh, having trouble with a third act on a play that he was working on. It was familiar. I could relate to that, and it really demystified the process
Did
in a
it
way.
make you feel like you weren't working hard enough on your stuff?
No, I was working hard. I don't think I was working correctly. You know, I think I wasn't coming at script problems or story problems, um, in a sort of measured, analytical way. Um, I wasn't sort of looking at the whole of whatever I was working on, a screenplay or a play. I wasn't looking at it, you know, um, as a three acts of a story. I was sort of focused on a scene, or I didn't understand why a character wasn't sort of working in a third act, not realizing that really my problem was probably in the first act or the first 15 minutes of my screenplay, and that the solve was really, in a place in the story that I wasn't looking. So I sort of gained this perspective of storytelling in terms of screenplays, that I think I had not been taught, or I didn't fully understand, and I did that just by watching people who were really good at it. So it was a cool experience for me.
And so from there, you basically, it sounds like you upped your skills. And then I imagine it wasn't long before you got paid. So, um, what was like the first time you got paid and how did that happen?
The first time I got paid, I optioned a screenplay. I had written a screenplay with a friend of mine. We co-wrote it, and it was a very interesting sort of story about how that happened. We wrote a screenplay. It found its way through various friends of ours into the hands of Mel Gibson. Now this was 1997. Okay, this was a
So
long
he
time.
was like A list at that time. I think Lethal Weapons were out, right? He was one of the biggest stars going.
One of the biggest stars in the world at that time, and I knew somebody who knew him, and this friend of mine, Paul, had read my screenplay, and unbeknownst to me, had handed it to Mel. And one day, I was working at a desk for a writer. I was a writer's assistant, at the time, and my phone rang, and it was Mel Gibson, thick Australian accent. And I, of course, it's very cliche, but I didn't believe it was him.
Right.
I thought somebody was fucking with me. You said we could curse on this, so
Yeah, for
I
sure.
thought somebody was fucking with me. But it turned out it was him. And he said, "Look, Paul gave me your screenplay. I think it's really good. I'm not going to buy it, but I want you to come out to my house, and I have some thoughts. And if you like the thoughts and, are interested in working on it, then maybe there's a future that we can figure out with your screenplay." And so, it's just this sort of dream moment where my friend and I, who I'd co-written the screenplay with, we drove out to Malibu in my broken down Toyota Corolla, and we went to Mel Gibson's house, and we sat down with him, and we did a page turn of this script that we had written. And he gave us notes, and he gave us, his thoughts on where the story should go and what needed to be fixed. And we went back and we did the work, and he ended up optioning it from us. So that was the first time I got paid.
Wow. Just way to start at the top, though.
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't a lot of money, Monique.
It never is, though, I feel like.
Yeah.
Um, but but like I think this really interesting lesson in this for like especially for newer writers, because like so often you hear newer writers asking like, well, how do you protect your script from somebody stealing it? I mean, do you have them sign an NDA? And of course no one has anyone sign an NDA, at least not the writer just starting having somebody to read their script sign the NDA. Sometimes it goes the
Yeah.
other way. Like if you're making a Star Wars movie or something, that then Lucasfilms will have you sign an NDA. But like this is kind of the lesson, right? Is like if you are being so protective of your script, it's not going to get accidentally into Mel Gibson's hands,
Right.
and that's what you actually want, right? So
Yeah.
it's kind of like I always hear that question, and I never really thought about like why don't we do it? And I think that's like a really good example of
Yeah.
why.
Yeah, I understand the hesitation for writers to hand their stuff out, and I understand the fear of an idea being stolen, perhaps, and I mean that's what you're talking about, just this overriding idea that somebody's going to steal your great idea, and I suppose that's possible, but you're right. You do need to get your writing out, being read by as many people as you can. You know, I happened to get lucky and it fell into Mel Gibson's hands. But had it not, other people would have read the script and I would have gotten notes back. I mean, that was the thing, early on when I was starting out. I used to love handing my writing out to others, anybody who was willing to read it and hearing feedback. I wanted to hear how somebody responded to it, and even if they weren't a writer and they couldn't articulate it in a way that was maybe uh, you know uh, clearly sort of understandable, I could sort of feel where they were having problems with it, and kind of look for the note behind the note. And so I was always doing that. I loved getting input. I still do. I still love getting input from anybody who will read anything I write.
Yeah, I mean, we all do. To get anyone to read at all seems like a huge
Yeah.
accomplishment at this point.
Yeah.
Um, but so what was the first thing you got made, and how did that end up happening?
I had a movie of the week made at FX. Was really technically the first thing I had made, but the first feature I had made was a movie called Machine Gun Preacher. Gerard Butler starring, Mark Forrester directed it, and it was a real passion project of mine, and really everybody who was involved in the movie. It was a true story. I had met a guy who had been a really, just a terrible person. I mean, he just was a drug dealer and a Hell's Angels member, and had done some very rough things in his life. And then he became a preacher who then devoted himself to saving war orphans in Sudan. And so I had been introduced to this guy, and he had told me his story, and I just was fascinated by it. And I went down the rabbit hole of what he had done and what was happening in Central Africa at the time, and I wrote a spec screenplay, and I was really sort of happy with the script, and I met Mark Forrester, who's a super talented director, and he had read it, and was excited about trying to make the movie, and so we happened to sort of pull this movie together, and that was the first movie that I had made.
Cool. And so what did that lead to? Like, how did you like, because if you've had a lot of movies made.
Yeah, I've had a lot of movies made. I'm lucky in that way. Um, that was having Machine Gun Preacher made was was important for me because really until that movie had been made, I really didn't know that I was ever going to have anything made as a writer, in Hollywood. I had, prior to Machine Gun Preacher being made, I had enjoyed a very good career as a screenwriter. I mean, I was making a fair amount of money every year writing. I was, being employed to come in and rewrite projects. And so it was working, but I couldn't, it seemed like I couldn't get the movies that I wanted to make, uh, made. And so I had, in many ways, kind of resigned to this idea that maybe I'm one of these guys that is going to hopefully have a career, you know, as a screenwriter, but maybe I don't get a movie made. I mean, that was really, you know, what I was kind of feeling at the time. And so, you know, having Machine Gun Preacher made was really important for me because I saw the process. I was able to see the process from beginning to end with that movie. I was involved in the process of making that movie, although I wasn't a producer technically on that movie. You know, I was close with Mark. I was close with Robbie Brenner. Gerard and I became close, and so you know they really brought me in to every aspect of it. I was there for every day of shooting and through post and so it was. I was able to see for the first time really my words on screen, um, and understand how that happened. And so it was just a huge education for me, and it was a confidence booster for me. Um, having a movie made, you know, made me believe that I could do this uh, at a high level. So it was, you know, it was really coming off of that movie. I felt very empowered as a writer in this town.
Yeah, that's awesome. And
Yeah,
also, I forget when or why I learned this, but if you could have a whole career as a screenwriter and like develop an option and write, and if you don't get something made, you cannot get an obituary in the New York Times because they literally won't put in any of the credits if they don't get made. So it's basically says, it might say like, oh, so and so was a screenwriter, or it
yeah,
might not even say that because like they don't have anything to fact check if it doesn't get made. So it's the craziest thing that there are like a ton of people in this town who've
yeah,
had full careers writing stuff that
yeah,
hasn't gotten made a ton of living on it. But
yeah.
like ultimately, if they died, there would be nothing to report in their obituary. So it's kind of just this weird thing I discovered like a few years back where I was like, oh, wow, that's great.
Yeah, that's that's crazy to me too because um, there are great writers out here that are you know helping these projects get made, and they might not be getting credit for them, but they're doing good work, and you're right, it is a career, and they're incredibly talented, and it's crazy in that way. The screenwriting business is crazy in that way that you could have, you could write for 15, 20 years in this town and nobody outside of a very small bubble would know who you were. Yet your sort of talent and your touch is all over, movies that have gone on to be big box office successes or critical, hits. It's crazy.
So yeah, so what's interesting about that is like now you have this new show Stick and it's a TV show and you
Yeah.
don't have any other TV credits that I
No.
can see, right? So how did you end up switching from feature films to TV? Like what was the process? What was the series of events? And like did you want that or was this like a movie first and then it became a TV show because that was just more popular?
Yeah.
So what's the story behind that?
You know, I mean, the character of Price, played by Owen Wilson in the show, was a character that had been kicking around in my head for a while. Versions of that character had shown up in features that I had tried to write or was making notes about. So I was very interested in the character of Price before he was named Price. But it wasn't until I started to sort of think about it as a TV show that it came together. And I mean, how it got to be a TV show. I had always, I love TV, and I had always wanted to do TV, but I was really sort of comfortable and familiar with the feature business. So I wasn't, you know, I was drawn to it from a storytelling perspective. I thought it would be interesting to try and tell a story in 8 or 10 episodes. That was that seemed like a challenge to me, and something I wanted to try and learn because I was really Monique. I was really tied to the 3 act, 120 page screenplay structure. I mean, I've been doing that for 25 years, and that is not the TV structure. It's just two totally different things. So I was intrigued by TV. I don't think I was willing to relearn how to tell a story in the way that I needed to do TV, and so I avoided it for a long time. My longtime manager and friend Guyman Cassidy, who is just a wonderful producer and of a lot of really great TV, really hounded me about stepping into the TV business and for a few years. And so, I had this idea for this show. I sort of ran it by him, and he said, this is exactly the kind of thing you should think about doing as your first TV show. So it took many years for me to step into the TV world. And I'm glad I did. It's been such a cool experience. It's been such a different way to tell a story, in 10 episodes versus, 120 pages.
Well, talk about that. Talk about like the difference, like,
Yeah.
how is it different for you? What did you have to learn specifically to go from features into TV?
In for me, telling a story, in the feature world, you always, I always needed to know where I was going to end. I needed to know, in many ways, for me, I needed to know what that end act two turning point was and sort of how the movie was going to end before I could really understand, where to begin in many ways. Um, I, with TV and I guess the feature world, you only have 120 pages. I mean, it's a really short amount of time to tell a good story. I found it to be, it forced a certain amount of editorial thinking when I thought about story in the feature world in a good way. I felt very constrained in a screenplay, and I learned how to sort of use that constraint positively. I knew that I needed to get to a certain place in a story by the midpoint of the screenplay. And if I wasn't getting there, then that showed me there was a problem in the first half of a screenplay. So I became very familiar with the constraints of a screenplay. And when I then started to think about TV, whether you're doing 8 or 10 episodes, whether it's half hour or it's an hour long format, you're just talking about, the constraints being pulled off. And that was a scary prospect for me. That meant me relearning how to introduce characters and how far I could go with characters. And I had to really, I had to teach myself how to let go a bit and let my hands go, when thinking about and writing about a character or a story. So it was, even as I'm saying this, I don't know that it's translating, but it was a very daunting prospect for me to sort of analyze TV and see what worked and how it was done. And I did a lot of that, and then kind of step into this process. It was scary.
Yeah, and so like considering you had never done TV before, it's interesting that they let you like
Yeah.
kind of run the whole show. What do you think gave them the confidence for you to do that, without like without pairing you with somebody
Right.
that could kind of guide you? What do you think happened there?
I Apple was really supportive of me from the very beginning. You know, I I had 20 plus years of experience at the feature level, and I wasn't just a writer, on many of those movies that I was part of. I was, you know, I had the good fortune of being brought into the process. So I felt comfortable about, you know, the sort of logistics of putting a show together and running a show. Maybe it was misguided confidence, but I had confidence, and Apple, to their credit, they let me run a writer's room, and that was really the first thing they did. I mean, before the show was greenlit, they said, "Look, we really like your show." I had written 2 episodes of the show. They really liked the 2 episodes. I walked them through what I wanted to do for a first season. And they let me open a writer's room, and they let me write, hire 7 writers of my choosing. And I I know writers, and I'm very confident in the process, and I appreciate writers, and how hard writers work, and what it takes to be a writer. And I felt that I could run a room well because of that. I'm just a big supporter of, young writers, and I think Apple saw that. I mean, I think they understood that, I was going to run a room, and it was going to be effective. And I was very communicative with them throughout the 22 weeks of that room. And I think it gave them confidence, frankly, in me. Then when we got a green light for the first season, I think had their confidence in me had grown over that, 22 weeks. And I wanted to run it. I felt like I was ready to do it. I felt like I could do it effectively. And, they gave me the go ahead to do it. So
So by the time you got the green light on the show, did you already have all the episodes written?
yeah, so this is a thing that it was important to me to come out of that 22 weeks with 10 episodes written. And so we did. We worked very hard. We came up with a really, I think, effective process in the room. And at the end of those 22 weeks, we had 10 episodes written, and 10 episodes that had gone through Apple Creative. So, you know, I think Apple, all of us just felt very good about what we had put on the page. Owen was brought into that process. He was very excited about the show that we had written. And so, that was a big part of it, Monique. I mean, we weren't going into production, having only 3 or 4 episodes written. I mean, we went in with a full understanding of the season. We
Mhm.
knew episodes that were going to maybe give us some challenges. So it was, in that way, I think all of us I think Apple probably felt better about handing me the
I
show.
mean, yeah, it was super low risk if you've already written the whole thing before they give you a green light, right?
Yeah,
Because they did green light the room. I mean, everyone got paid for that, so they did give
correct.
you something before green lighting the show. And
Yeah,
so it's interesting. I mean, it's just interesting to hear that because that's such like a modern kind of newer way of doing things. And
yeah,
on the one hand, it makes sense because they're not really risking all the money before they green light the show, and the writers still get paid.
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
but on the other hand, yeah, no, on the other hand, there is no other hand. I guess it does make sense. But but
It's
on the other hand,
also,
I guess on the other hand, you could have written like this great show and no one would have ever seen it. So I guess
yeah,
that's the other hand, is that like all that work, but that happens all the time anyways, I guess, with pilots and features. So
yeah,
it would just be like, okay, well, more people got paid before it didn't go anywhere.
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
but
Right, right, right.
but speaking of Owen Wilson, so I did want to kind of talk about that because, like, well, we haven't mentioned what the show is about for anyone who hasn't seen it yet. So before I get into this, maybe just like a quick,
Oh,
logline or pitch about like what the show is, so that people know what we're talking about, and then I have
okay.
questions about
Yeah. The Owen Wilson in the show, when we meet him, um, plays a former PGA professional, who at one point in his life had been a very good pro golfer. He'd been 18th, ranked 18th in the world. But when we meet him, he's 20, 25 years past his prime. And he sort of has woken up to this idea that the best years of his life are behind him, and that maybe he squandered a great talent that he was given. And he meets a young man, named Santi, played by Peter Dagger, who um, is an unknown golfer. He meets him on a driving range, shagging balls, and this kid, Owen Wilson's character Price, sees that he may be the best golfer of his generation. And he decides to Price decides to risk everything to take this kid on the road to try and, you know, dial in his game and get him to do well at the US Amateur Championship. And so, what happens is that Price, along with his best friend Mitz, played by Mark Maron, with Santi's mother, played by Mariana Trevino, um, and Lily Kay, who becomes somebody who jumps in on this road trip. They go on this summertime road trip, and it's this real sort of coming of age story for the kid. It's this opportunity for Price to, in many ways, redeem himself and his career that really kind of blew up 20 years earlier. And it's this really, I think, beautiful story about a found family that comes together and helps each other kind of through, you know, issues and problems in their life.
Great, yeah. So, great pitch.
Yeah.
That's exactly what it is. But but why golf? That I was wondering too. Like, why golf? Was it because like, oh, there hasn't been a TV series in the world of golf, or is it because you're obsessed with golf? Or when did, because you said the character was roaming in your head
Yeah.
over many, many different iterations and many scripts. Was it always a golfer, or was that part of what made it all stick?
No, it was originally, it was uh the character was a baseball player. My dad was a professional baseball player, and had played parts of 2 seasons, in the pros. He was a pitcher for the Minnesota Twins, and then left professional baseball, to pursue a career as a stockbroker, and a businessman. So that was sort of the origin of that character. And in the previous iterations, he had been a baseball player, he had been a football player at one point. Golf provided this really cool opportunity uh to tell a story, um you know in the world of golf, in a sport that is completely singular. I mean, there's no, a golfer is out there on the golf course competing against himself first. I mean, it's one on one before a golfer ever attacks a golf course, or, you know, has to sort of strategize their way around, a tricky par five. They have to, sort of address what's going on in their mind, you know what I mean? And so it was just a very cool, it was a cool sport to then place a character who was facing personal challenges, because for me, it sort of, it parallels what Price goes through in the show, but also what this kid Santi goes through. They're wrestling with personal struggles, very sort of private personal struggles. And you know I saw golf as this great metaphor for that same thing. You see a professional golfer out there, they're struggling with themselves, and how they feel about themselves or what they've just done on the golf course. And I don't know, there was something that just kind of snapped together for me, for these characters in this story and the sport of golf.
Do you play golf?
I do play golf. Yeah.
Okay. So you knew a lot about it and you had a personal experience with that personal one-on-one struggle, I guess.
I think anybody who, I'm not a very good golfer. I love it, and I play it whenever I can. Anybody who takes up the game of golf immediately understands it's purely a one-on-one game. I mean, it's astonishing, in that way. I mean, golf, you know, you realize very quickly that it has very little to do with necessarily the mechanics of your swing or how strong you are. It has everything to do with how you're feeling in the moment before you swing the club. And that never changes. It doesn't matter if you're a first time golfer or you're one of the best in the world. That fact always remains in golf. So that was fascinating to me, as a not very good golfer, because I knew it was the same thing for all golfers out there.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I don't play golf, but I totally see what you're saying because I think that applies to also games like pool and, you know, you know,
Tennis, you know.
tennis. Yeah, like games where you're like, I know I can do this, and then you mess it up and you're so angry at yourself. Like a lot of individual sports,
Yeah, yeah.
basically.
And that's just a different mindset that I find fascinating. You don't have a team behind you that you can rely on when things are, not going well. It's you, and you have to adjust and pivot when things aren't going well. And are you able to do that? That's a fascinating concept to me.
So I haven't forgotten my question about Owen Wilson. I did
Yeah.
have this feeling about the cast and like starting with Owen Wilson, like like I want to know about like what the casting process was and how much the cast informed the the dialogue and how much the dialogue informed the cast, because it really feels like the people like Owen Wilson is just perfectly cast and Mark Maron is perfectly cast, and they just seem like they're just like, so I was wondering, like, was that how did one affect the other? Like, at what point did Owen Wilson came on? It sounds like he was in the writing room, so I could see how he could kind of like put it into his own tone. I mean, they're both very specific,
Yeah.
like everyone seemed so well cast, like it was just each role was kind of made for them.
Yeah, I mean, I have to just say, I had just one of the best casting directors in the world, Rachel Tenner, um, you know, part of this project, which was so helpful in many levels. But the first two episodes I wrote, Owen wasn't attached to the project. As soon as he came in, or really, as soon as somebody mentioned him to me, there was nobody else I could think of other than him for the role. And you're right. Owen and Mark too. They're so specific. Their voices are so unique. Uh, when I first met Owen, and he had read the first couple scripts, um, just sitting down with him at breakfast, I found myself thinking and about him in the role. And it was really, neither of us knew it at that point, because he wasn't signed on to the project. He had other things that were preventing him from becoming attached. He had other movies that he was doing, but we were meeting about it. And each time we met about it, you know he would bring up a little piece of dialogue, or we would talk about a scene, and what he would say, or the way he would say it, I would be scribbling on my phone. I'd be typing on my phone, making notes, or remembering the way his voice sounds, and going back and sort of adjusting the script, because it was just so it was just so organic, and um, you know just absolutely singular the way the guy sounds. So, to answer your question, as soon as Owen came aboard, he affected all of it. I mean, he affected the way that scenes were crafted. I invited him to come into the process. I invited Mark Maron. I invited all my actors to come into the process, because I'm a firm believer that you know my draft of a script, is the blueprint for, hopefully what will be a better version. And, I was surrounded by these absolutely, fantastic actors with real points of view and real voices. And I told them when I first cast them, I just said, look, I want to hear what you think about any given part of this show, and let's talk about it. And we did that for all 10 episodes. I mean, Lily Kay, who plays Zero in the show, she would have ideas about something she was saying, or the tenor of a scene that she felt needed to maybe shift one way or the other. And I took those ideas, you know, very seriously, because I think that's what makes, a scene just come alive, when the actor feels like it's part of them and they're invested in it. So it was such a fun part of the process for me too, because, I had not only seven beautiful, writers who were offering their input on the scripts, but then I had this great cast that was also improving everything every time we looked at it. It was an amazing experience.
Yeah, and how did you end up with Mariana Trevino? I mean, I know she was like a huge
Yeah.
rom-com star in Mexico, but I
Yeah.
had never seen her do anything in America.
I didn't know her work before Rachel Tenner called me up and said, I want you to look at Mariana. And, I was just really swept away the first time I saw her. And then I met her a couple times and, brought her into chemistry read with Peter and Owen. And again, it was one of those things where you know, Elena was written on the page, and we were really happy with the Elena that we had built on the page. And then Mariana steps into it and then just blows the doors off of this character and offers all sorts of different colors and you know different little quirks and you know manners of speech that we hadn't thought of. And it's one of those things where you get somebody like Mariana, who I just as soon as I met her I just thought, oh my god, she's so fantastic. You just sort of step back and you try not to get in the way of a fantastic actor bringing a scene to life. You want to make sure that there are some guardrails because some things have to happen in a scene. But you know, my entire cast, I mean, Owen and Peter and Mark and Mariana and Lily, I mean, they all just stepped in, and it was almost, I just enjoyed watching them work every day on set because they were just bringing such life to these scenes. It was great.
Yeah, and a lot of comedy people. So like that's another thing I was wondering about. Like, I mean, looking at your credits, it seems like it might be your first comedy. Is that wrong? Or like, how did this end up being a comedy from you? You know?
I know you look at my credits, and there are a lot of dramas and there's a lot of action movies.
Mhm.
That sort of happened surprisingly for me. I mean, I started out as a comedy writer. Comedy was always a thing that I was very interested in when I first came out to Hollywood and was kicking around the business. Comedy was it. I mean, I really, the screenplay that I optioned to Mel Gibson was a comedy that I had written. Um, so I was sort of on a path toward that, and then it sort of turned into something else. And I had, thankfully, a really long career doing other things as well. But it was great to come back to comedy, and coming back to this show was, the first time in 20 plus years that I was actually able to put that hat on and make myself laugh and try and make other people laugh. And it was really, it's more fun writing a comedy than a heavy drama. That's my
I
point of view.
agree. No, I couldn't agree more.
Yeah.
Um, and then, I mean, I guess we kind of talked about like what it was like working with Apple because like they don't do that many shows, so there aren't that many people who have that experience. Like, is there anything you can share about them? I mean, you can't really compare it to other networks because I guess this was your first, but
Yeah. I had written a pilot for CBS a year before I sold Stick to Apple, so I had a little experience, but not really. You're right. I found Apple to be really a sort of dream partner for me in this project, on this project. They from the I pitched them this show. That's how I sold them this show. And from the moment they, you know, wanted to be involved in it, they were absolutely supportive of my vision for the show. And they really encouraged me to, you know, kind of go deep into places that I wanted to go. And um, I just found them, and I've worked for 20 plus years in the studio system, so I understand the process at a studio level, and for features, and it's maybe not terribly different, but Apple, they were just, they were very encouraging, and all along the way, I mean, they really, you know, had my back, and it was just a really great experience. I have to say, it was fantastic.
awesome. So
Yeah.
Points
Nice.
for Apple.
Points
Um,
for Apple. Points for Apple.
I mean, what are you going to say, right? But at the same time,
No,
points for
no. I would be honest with you. I've had it's been tricky experience. I've had tricky experiences in 20 plus years of writing. I mean, it's not easy, as you know. It's
Yeah.
rough out there. This one was maybe an outlier in my career, in that um, you know, Monique, I know you've been in this business for a long time too. It was the first time. It was one of the only times where you know handing scripts into a studio. In this case, it was Apple. What I was getting back was really smart, thoughtful, challenging questions.
Mm.
That's not always the case. I found the creative team at Apple, they were taking the time to really read these scripts and really willing to get into deep conversations about, you know, pick your character and what I wanted to do with those characters and how I was going to do it. And, that isn't always the case. I mean, you don't always get that sort of hands on, deeply thoughtful input from a studio partner. And just right away, I realized I was getting that from Apple. And, I sort of breathed a sigh of relief at that point, because I thought, oh, great, this isn't going to be the other thing where you're kind of rolling your eyes and they don't get it or they're not understanding. That wasn't the experience that I had with Apple, and that was really refreshing, and it was energizing to me. I
Yeah.
knew that, oh, this studio is understanding this project and they're understanding me, and that was helpful.
Yeah, I feel like there are so many conversations amongst writers where it's like, okay, let's figure out how we can not take this note. But the
Yeah.
fact is, like, when you get smart executives, it's just so wonderful. It's so
Oh,
fun. And when you feel like you can trust them.
yeah.
So that's kind of awesome.
It was
Yeah.
great. It was great. And when you get those notes and you can trust them, and you can play with them creatively and know that that's okay to do that. That's a really unique experience too, where you sort of have you have this feel the safety and the freedom to say, oh, I hear your note. Here's my reaction to your note. Let's get into a conversation about where this could maybe go. I've never, or I very often have felt safe to do that with a studio partner.
Mm.
And when you do feel that sort of creative connection, that's a really special thing when that happens.
Yeah, it's awesome. All
Yeah.
right. So we're going to wrap up pretty soon. But first, I
Okay.
would like to do some rapid response questions. Are you
Oh no, come
prepared?
on, Monique.
Are you prepared for some rapid
No.
response?
It's late in the day. I don't know if I'm rapid response anything, but no, let's
Uh,
do it.
we'll
Do it.
give it a try. We'll give it a try.
Okay.
I guess you can say pass if you don't have anything.
Okay. All right. Great.
What is one pitch tip you can share?
Oh, okay. My one pitch tip would be God, I have a few. My one pitch tip would be to check in with your audience and see how they're processing or tracking what you're pitching periodically. That's a thing that I found was very helpful. I would literally stop the pitch process and say, Monique, are you with me here? And give you an opportunity to go, yeah, although I can explain this to me. Or I found that doing that in a pitch engaged the people that I was pitching in a way that gave them some participation. I could
Mhm.
answer questions as they came, sort of down the pipeline. And I just found it helpful for the whole room, really.
Yeah, I think that's a great, I'm supposed to be rapid response, but I just want to say, especially with
Yeah.
Zoom now, where
Yeah.
it's like so much harder to gauge if they're like texting somebody else in the pitch or if they're
Yeah.
texting their significant other or if they're actually listening. I think that's great. Okay, what is one quality a writer must display in an interview to get hired?
Oh man. I think a lack of ego is what pops to mind. And I just want to, qualify that phrase. I think, I think people who are interviewing writers, or, as a showrunner, I interviewed a lot of writers, met a lot of writers, and I wanted to meet talented, interesting writers who I knew that I could engage at a level that both of us felt safe enough to share ideas and not feel um, pressured or judged, and I think that enable to do that, you have to have your ego in check. And I think, if I'm hiring a writer and somebody comes in and I sense, somebody who's defensive, or who is unwilling to maybe talk about an idea that maybe isn't working, that's concerning for me. That's worrisome for me. So that's the sense, I think, that you want to give to somebody who you might be working for is, hey, I'm a collaborator, and I'm here to sort of work with you and find something great together. That's a really important quality to convey, I think.
That's a great answer. What is the best way for a new staff writer to, well, the question here is to get asked back, but I'm kind of almost more curious about what is the best way for someone not to get asked back. Well, I guess that could be uh,
Oh,
water. So
not
answer either one.
well. I think I hired two first-time writers in my season one writers' room for Stick. Both writers had been assistants to writers before becoming staff writers in my room. And the thing I asked of them, I mean, I asked this of every writer in the room, but specifically of them, and I had conversations with both of them separately from the room. I said, it is really important to me that you have a real voice in this room. I did not want the staff writers who are brand new at this level, sitting around a table with, some veteran writers. I mean, I hired some other writers who had been around for 20 plus years and had won Emmys and were just very impressive writers. But to my staff writers, I said, it is really important that you absolutely speak up. I'm always going to be supportive of you saying what you're feeling about anything. I, 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 I value your input as much as I value so and so's input at the other end of the table who's got 3 Emmys. There's no difference for me. I want to hear you sharing your thoughts. And
That's great.
so I think if I were to have another staff writer come in, should I be so lucky as to do a season 2 of Stick, that's the thing that I would want to see from them, is somebody who's boldly saying what they want to say. And that's important, I think.
And that's unusual. I mean, I think that makes you a good leader, that you're open to, the best idea wins rather than the most hierarchical idea. Um,
You know, I've heard that. I heard that is oftentimes in these rooms that the staff writers are not encouraged to speak up, and that boggles my mind. Because they're in the room because they're good enough to be in the room. I mean, we've read their writing, they've displayed real talent. There's a sharp storyteller there. It might be their first time in the room, but they're a sharp storyteller, enough so that they've been hired to be in the room. To in any way silence them makes no sense to me at all. And I heard that before I opened my room, and I just thought, there's no way I'm doing that in this room. Everyone's gonna be heard from in this room.
um, awesome. Well, I think you answered some great rapid fire
They
questions.
weren't very rapid fire,
They
though.
weren't,
That was my fault.
but I no, I mean, but like I think your answers were so useful and clear, and I think that's really great.
Right.
So anyway, but we are gonna have to leave momentarily. I do want to find out, like, if people want to find you, follow you, where can they reach you?
Oh yeah. Okay. Well, I'm new to social media, but I am on Instagram. Jason Keller 777 is my handle on Instagram. Um, but yeah, that's how they would reach me.
Awesome. And I am at Monique Sorgen everywhere that I'm on.
Oh,
Um,
great, great.
anyway, so thank you so much. Everybody go watch Stick on Apple so we can get that second season and get those writers rehired and see who Jason hires as his new staff writer next
Let's
time.
let's get those writers writing. Let's get those writers writing in this town. Thank you,
Yeah.
Monique. It's been a
So,
real pleasure.
so great to have you. And thanks everybody for listening to Third and Fairfax.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Third and Fairfax. You can listen and subscribe to Third and Fairfax on Spotify, Apple, and Libsyn, and watch us on the Writers Guild of America West's YouTube channel. Also check out writtenby.com, the Guild's online publication, for more on writer craft, career, and union life. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.